What's good, y'all? Today I'm going to be teaching you guys how to make your own backpack with this step-by-step tutorial. I love making these bags because they're super functional and they're really customizable as well. This bag design is really so perfect for a travel bag to use as your personal bag at the airport, or just for a beach day, carrying all your stuff there. For school, there's so many different uses of it. I think it's a really good size of backpack, and the functionality of it as well just makes it super convenient. I've made a few of these before and it's been a very highly requested pattern, so I figured it was finally time to get you guys the pattern and the tutorial. The link to the pattern is below. Once you get it, it'll be emailed to you as a PDF that you can print off right at home. It'll come with some extra notes, guides, and some chances to win some free things. And then this video will give you all the extra information you need, as well as the step-by-step tutorial to help you make this pattern come to life. I'll also be doing some extra things throughout this video to customize this bag, but the focus of this video is going to be on making this bag in its simplest form. I would say this pattern is probably in the intermediate range, but at the end of this video, I will go over a few things that can help make it a bit more beginner friendly. Also, don't be intimidated by this pattern as you watch the video. It is a lot of pieces, but it's really not any more difficult than any of my other patterns. Admittedly though, it is a lot of steps and a lot of pieces, a lot of prep work, but as long as you have the patience for it, I promise it's going to be worth it. I hope you guys are as excited as I am. A lot of you have been asking for this one, so let's get to it. All you're going to need is the base fabric of your choice, the lining fabric of your choice, interfacing, the pattern, 2 1-inch rectangle rings, 2 1-inch sliders, a 1-inch triangle ring, 12 grommets that are between 1/4 inch and 3/8 of an inch, a 1/8 H cord for the piping, as well as a cord that's 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch for the pull cord. Then glue, tape, and rivets are optional but highly recommended. For the interfacing, I recommend medium to heavyweight. I'm using Pellon Craft Fuse. I also recommend heavyweight backing. I'm using both Celtec and Decoville Heavy. If you want something easily accessible, you can find Decoville Heavy easily online and even at Joann's. I like to use fusible webbing as well to help fuse the interfacing and backing in place. I also like to use contact cement for some parts of the bags, but you can get by with just regular fabric glue. You'll also need some sort of closure method. I'm using 6 1-inch quick release buckles, but there's lots of different things you could use, and I'll talk about this at the end of the video. Lastly, you'll need foam. I recommend Pellon one-sided fusible foam for a good beginner option, but you could also use EVA foam as well. I'll start by printing the pattern at 100% scale on 8.5 by 11-inch paper. Then you'll want to check this test square here to make sure it printed properly. You can start cutting out all the pattern pieces, being as precise as possible. It's important to get really clean cuts. Once all the pattern pieces are cut out, you can start taping any numbered ones together, so A1 to A1, A2 to A2, and so on. This will create the full pieces. There's a handful of pieces that say cut on fold, and you can cut those on a fold, or what I prefer to do is print the pieces twice, mirror them, and tape the pieces together to create the full pieces. Also, quick note on a couple of the pieces. The lining piece angles in as it goes down, so make sure that you are stacking those together in the correct order. Also, the side panel piece does look a little bit weird, but once it's all taped together, this is what it should look like. Now that all the pattern pieces are ready to go, we're ready to start cutting the fabric. Some of the base pieces call for interfacing. Since I made these sheets of fabric that are a bit bigger than my pattern pieces, I'm just going to get the interfacing on now before I cut those pieces out, but it's up to you whether you do it before or after cutting. So I'll go ahead and fuse my interfacing on the pieces that call for it, then I'll start cutting everything out. Take your time getting clean cuts. It'll also be helpful later on if you mark the middles of all your pieces as you cut them out. Now that everything is cut, we're ready to move on. I already have the interfacing on the pieces that need it, but if you haven't added it yet, go ahead and do that now. I'm going to do all the prep work, starting by getting the heavyweight backing and foam on. I'll do the bottom piece first. As you can see, the heavyweight backing is a bit smaller than its respective base piece since we don't want to sew it into the seam. So I'll mark a 1/2 inch from the edge all the way around, and the backing should fit within that area perfectly. Since the backing won't be sewn into the seam and there's not top stitching on the bottom, you may want to add an extra layer of protection to lock that backing in place, in which case you could cut a piece of lightweight interfacing to fuse on. This way when it's sewn, it sandwiches the backing in there. However, since I'm adding purse feet, those will help lock the backing in place, so I'm not worried about it. On the same note, if you want to add purse feet, there's markings on the bottom you can use to add them. Next, I'll do both my side panel base pieces. I'll start by marking a 1/2 inch from both of the side edges and the lower edge, but only 3/8 of an inch from the top edge. I'm doing that because the top edge will be folded and all the other edges will be sewn into seams, so they need a bit more space to roll around the backing. Next, I'm going to do the back bar. For this one, I'll mark 3/8 of an inch down from both the long edges, and I'll mark a 1/2 inch from both of the shorter edges. And once again, I'll get the backing in place in that area. Now I'll do both the triangle pieces. I'll start by marking the middle, then I'll mark a 1/2 inch from the edge on all 3 sides. The backing should fit within these 2 areas with a small gap between the backing pieces. Lastly, I'll do the back piece. Unlike the front, this piece doesn't have the interfacing since I'm adding foam instead. So I'll go ahead and mark a 1/2 inch from the 2 side edges and the lower edge since those will be sewn into seams. But for the top edge, I'm only going to mark 7/16 of an inch. The reason the top edge is 7/16 of an inch instead of 3/8 of an inch is because since the foam has a little bit more loft to it, even though this edge will be folded, it needs a bit more space to fold over the edge of the foam. Once I have all my backings on, I'm ready to start doing a bunch of gluing. I'll start with the 2 side base pieces. I'm going to mark 3/4 of an inch down from the top edge on both pieces. Then you'll get some glue or tape within that area and fold the edges down to the lines we just marked out. Now I'll do the same thing for the back bar, except this time I'll mark 3/4 of an inch from both the top and bottom, and I'll fold those edges into their respective lines. For the triangle pieces, I'm going to mark 1 inch from the long edge, and once again, I'll fold that edge up to the line. Then the triangles are done and I can set those aside for now. I'm going to make the strap connectors now. I don't typically put heavyweight backing on these. I only am because the fabric I'm using for these is super light. So just ignore that. You're going to do this the exact same regardless. So I'll start by marking a 1/2 inch from both the shorter edges on the wrong side. I'll get some glue within those areas and fold the edges to those lines. Then I'll mark the middle, spread some glue on there, and I'll fold one side into the middle, then fold the other side in so the 2 edges meet in the middle. Once you've done this for all 4 pieces, the strap connectors are done. Next, I'll do the strap loops, which follows the exact same process as the strap connectors. I'll start by marking a 1/2 inch from both the shorter edges, get some glue on there, fold those edges to their lines, then I'll mark the middle and fold both of those sides into the middle. And just like that, the strap loops are done. Now I'll do all the flap straps. These don't need finished edges on the ends, so I'll get straight to it, marking the middle across the long side, then I'll fold one side into that line and fold the other side in so that both edges meet in the middle. Once I've done this for all 4, the flap straps are done. I'm going to make my front straps now. These are the ones that attach to the buckles on the front. You'll notice you're supposed to cut 2 pieces that are 4 inches wide. Instead, I cut 4 pieces that are 2 inches wide so that I can make the best use of the pattern of the fabric I have. But it's essentially the exact same thing either way, just instead of folding the piece in half twice, you're folding 2 separate pieces in half and then combining those pieces. Regardless, I'll start by marking a 1/2 inch from the edge on just one of the shorter ends, and I'll fold the edge to that line. Then I'll mark the middle and fold one side into that line, turn it, and fold the other side into the middle as well. Now I have both halves of my strap. If I had started this at 4 inches, it would be one big piece that I had folded in half, but instead I have the 2 separate pieces. So I'm going to glue those 2 pieces together, matching the 2 finished edges together, and working my way down towards the unfinished end, making sure all the edges match up as I go. Then I'll do the back straps. These are what connect to the shoulder strap to make them adjustable. I follow the exact same process I just did for the front straps, again with only one of the ends having a finished edge. Literally the only difference is these back straps are a bit shorter. The process is the exact same. And finally, I'll do the pocket straps. I'll follow the exact same process for these 2. The only difference is that for the other straps, I only needed one end to be a finished edge, but for the pocket straps, both ends need to be finished. Other than that, process is the exact same, and once they're done, they should look something like this. Next, I'm going to make the triangle ring connector, which is what will connect the triangle ring to the back bar. This one's quick and easy. I'm just going to mark the middle, then fold both sides into that middle line. The inner dimensions of the triangle rings often vary, but it should fit on there nicely. Now I need to make the other strap connector. I'm going to start by marking a 1/2 inch down from the top edge and folding that edge down to the line. Then I'll do the sides, then I'll do the angled sides, and then I'll do the bottom. So just folding it all the way around, going edge by edge. Just do your best to keep everything even as you go around. Once all 4 are done, they should look something like this. this. Later I'll be matching them up to connect to the shoulder straps. The last thing I need to do is make the piping cord. I'll need a strip of fabric that's 1¼ inch wide and at least 33 inches long, and I'll cut a piece of 1/8 inch cording that's the same length. Then I'll go ahead and make that piping cord, and I'll cut 1/4 inch slits across the edge. This is what's going to allow it to spread nicely around the curves. To do the piping, you will need a presser foot that can get right up next to the cord, because that's what's going to give you your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So if you don't have a presser foot like that and can't get one, you'll need to skip this. And on the same note, if you use a different size cord, you'll need to adjust the width of the fabric strip so that you still have your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. All of the prep work is done. So just to recap, you should have your back bar with both the long edges folded down, the 2 side panel base pieces with the top edges folded down, both triangle pieces with the long edge folded, then the triangle ring connector, the main flap straps and the pocket flap straps, the 4 strap connectors, the 6 strap loops, the 2 pocket straps, the 2 front straps, and the 2 back straps, as well as the piping cord and 4 strap connectors. You'll also need to make a handle. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through the whole process of how I make my rolled handles, but if you don't know how, I have a full step-by-step tutorial that I'll link below. The only difference for this handle is you don't need to have finished edges at the bottom, and the pinches will be 1¼ inch up on each side. Now that everything is prepped, we're ready to get into the sewing, but first I have a few notes for you guys. First, I'm going to be sewing all of the seams with a 3mm stitch length and doing all the top stitching with a 4mm stitch length. Second, all of the seams are going to be sewn with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, with the exception of the 2 flaps as well as the shoulder strap. The reason for that is because I find it easier to sew around the curves and corners of those pieces with the tighter seam allowance. And since I'm going to be grading those pieces anyways once they're sewn, might as well save the extra fabric. Third, some of the fold allowances are 1/4 inch and some are 3/8 of an inch. So make sure to reference all of the dashed lines on the pattern pieces that have them to know what you're folding for each piece. Lastly, I'll be using a Tex 90 bonded nylon thread. I'm able to use a heavyweight thread because I have an industrial machine. If you're doing this on a domestic machine, just use what thread you can. It'll still come out beautifully. You also may see me use this machine a handful of times throughout the process, but in the past I've never used this machine to make this bag before. So all of this can be done on a flatbed machine or even a domestic machine. I'm just using it because I have it and it can make a couple parts a bit easier. I'm going to start with the front straps. You'll see these markings for the straps on the pattern piece, and you'll want to just transfer those markings to the fabric. The line at the top is where the straps will be sewn down. Only the lower section of the strap is sewn down since the top needs to be able to fold over. This means I need to sew the top section first, and since the wrong side of the strap will be facing up when it's folded over, I'm going to do the top stitching on the wrong side. So on the back side, I'm going to mark 10⅔ of an inch up from the unfinished edge. Then I'm going to sew 1/8 of an inch from the edge, starting at that line, and I'll sew up, stitch across the finished edge, and go back down the other side until I get back to that line. Then I'll get half the buckle on, and I can stick the straps in place using my markings with the right side facing up. And now I can sew the strap on, so I'll sew from the bottom all the way up to the line, then I'll sew across that line to where the stitching ends on the other side and all the way back down to the bottom. I'm going to do the exact same thing for the side pocket straps now. Again, the top is where the straps are supposed to be sewn down, so I'll mark that distance from the bottom up on the wrong side of the strap, and I'll sew from that line up, across, and then back down. Once again, I'll get the straps in place and sew them down. The only difference with these is I'll be sewing across the bottom as well, since I have a finished edge on that side too this time. And that's just because these aren't going to be sewn into a seam like the ones on the front are. So I'll sew it 1/8 of an inch from the edge, sewing a full rectangle in that lower area, matching up with where my stitching ends on the top. Once the straps are sewn on, you can add a rivet right below where the stitching ends if you want to add a bit of extra durability. Either way, I'm going to move on to the strap loops now. These will hold the strap in place when they fold over. You'll notice the loops are a tiny bit bigger than the markings for them. This is because the loops are supposed to be compressed a bit to create this little arch for the straps to fit under. So now on the right side, I'm going to mark 1/2 inch from each end, and I'm going to sew between those 2 marks. The rest will be sewn when I attach the loops. So I go ahead and sew between those 2 lines 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and I'll do that on both sides. Now I'm going to sew these outer areas to attach the loops. So I'll stick the loops in place using the markings on the pattern. Again, they're supposed to be compressed in a bit. Then I'll sew a little rectangle 1/8 of an inch from the edge in the outer areas on both sides of all 6 loops. connecting with the stitching across the middle. You could also add rivets, do an X stitch or so on to add some sort of durability to those loops. It's completely up to you. I'm gonna get my straps on the flaps now. There's markings on the pattern for where they'll go. The lower line is where the straps will be sewn down, not necessarily where they're gonna end. So on the wrong side, I'll mark 1 3/4 of an inch from one end on all 4 straps, as well as 1 3/8 of an inch and 3/8 of an inch. Since the buckle will sit in the middle of this area and I don't want to get glue on it, I'm only going to glue the outer 2 areas and not the middle. So I'll get some glue in those outer areas, then I'll fold the edge to that 1 3/4 of an inch mark. Now that I have half the buckles on there, I'll follow the markings on the pattern and I'll get the strap stuck in place on both the main flap and the pocket flaps. Then I'll sew them on, stitching 1/8 of an inch from the edge from the end all the way to about 1/8 of an inch before the hardware. Then I'll sew across, which should be right where the marking ends on the pattern. Then I'll turn again and sew all the way back up to the end. I'll do this for all 4 straps, then they should look something like this. And now I can finish the flaps. So I'll take the other half of my flaps and match them right sides together with the pieces I just sewed and clip them in place. Then starting at the back, I'll sew all the way around. Remember, the flaps are my only pieces that are sewn with a 1/4 inch seam allowance other than the shoulder straps. So I'll sew all the way around 1/4 of an inch from the edge, making sure things stay lined up as I go, stopping at the back on the other side and only leaving that back open. Then I'll trim 1/8 of an inch off around the curves. This is gonna help all the curves sit nicely. And now I can flip the flaps right side out, making sure the curves are pushed out fully and everything is even on both sides. Then I can top stitch it, so I'll sew 1/8 of an inch from the edge all the way around. Go slow and make sure you stay in line with the curves. As I'm sure you've noticed by now, this is also why I mark out where the straps should be sewn down and not where they end, because I have to make sure they're sewn down far enough that I can kind of lift them up and keep them out of the way as I sew around the flap. This isn't required, but I also like to stuff some fusible webbing down in there and fuse the 2 halves of the flap together. This way they bend and fold all as one piece, but you don't have to do this. It'll be completely fine without it. But either way, the flaps are done now and I'll move on to the sides. The first thing I'm gonna do is mark 3/4 of an inch from both of these inner edges. Then just up by the corner, I'm also gonna mark 3/8 of an inch. I'll cut from the corner right up to the 3/8 of an inch corner, and this will allow both edges to fold back. Now I'll get some glue on there and fold these edges to their respective lines, making sure the corner is nice and sharp. And this will leave me with my area for my pocket to be sewn into. Now I'm gonna start on the pocket base, which fits right in that area I just finished. So from the top, I'm gonna mark 5/8 of an inch down as well as 1 inch. Then I'll take my flap, I'll match the middles and I'll stick it in place even with that lower line, right sides together. Then I'll baste it on, so I'll sew 1/8 of an inch from the edge all the way across. Now I'm gonna get the pocket base lining ready. So from the top, I'll mark 3/4 of an inch down and I'll fold the edge down to that line. And I'll get the lining in place, so I'll tape it on there, matching the top edge with the 5/8 inch line I marked out earlier. Then I'll sew across the top 1/8 of an inch from the edge to lock the lining and flap in place. If you want to add a second row of stitching for durability, go ahead, but since I'm using heavyweight thread, I'm not worried about it. Either way, I can baste the rest of the lining on, so I'll sew the other 3 sides at 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Now I'll move on to the pockets themselves. So from the lower edge, I'm going to mark 3/8 of an inch up. When I sew, I'm going to stop at that line because I want to leave 3/8 of an inch that can be folded out to fit into the seam allowance. So I'll match those edges right sides together, and starting at the end, I'll sew all the way from the edge to those lines I marked out. And once I've done this for both sides of both base and both lining pocket pieces, they should look something like this, with this little open area on the end so that they're able to spread open and make this little square. I also like to trim a bit of those seams and press them open, but that's completely up to you. Then I'll match the base and lining pieces up right side together and clip them in place, and I can sew across the top 3/8 of an inch from the edge on both pieces. Now I can flip that seam right side out and make sure it's pressed nice and even. Then I'll top stitch it, sewing 1/8 of an inch from the edge to lock those pieces in place. I can baste the rest of the lining on now, so I'll make sure it matches up edge to edge on all 3 sides. Then I'll sew each of those sides 1/8 of an inch from the edge. I'm almost ready to get the pockets on now, but first you'll want to mark 3/8 of an inch from the lower edge as well as both sides. These little squares in the lower corners will be a guide for the lower pocket area, and I also want to mark 3/8 of an inch from the top edge as my upper guide. So I'll get my pockets in place. I think it's easiest to get the outer 2 edges lined up and stitched first, then do the lower edge. So I'll match the top of the pocket with my 3/8 inch line on top and the lower edge of the pocket with the 3/8 of an inch line on bottom. I'll do this for both sides and then I'll go ahead and baste those in place. Then I'll do the lower edge, so I'll match the outer edges with the outer 3/8 of an inch mark and baste that in place as well. The pockets are done now. I'll tuck the flap inside the pocket to keep it out of the way for now, and as you can see, the pocket will fit nicely within that empty area. You can use tape or glue for this, but you'll want to stick it in place, matching the edges of the pocket with the folded edge of the base all the way around, making sure the ends line up too. Then I'll stitch it in place, top stitching 1/8 of an inch from the edge across one side, turning at the corner and stitching all the way down to the other edge. Once you've done that for both pockets, your side should look something like this. Now I just need to get the bases on, which we already folded the top edge down on earlier when we did the prep work. So I'll match the bottom of the pockets with the folded edge of the base, making sure the ends match as well. You'll want to push the bottom of the pocket up a bit to keep it out of the way as you do this. Then I'll top stitch those together, sewing 1/8 of an inch from the edge all the way across. The side panels are done now and should look something like this, and now we can move on to the back of the bag. I'm going to start with the shoulder straps. The first thing I need to do is mark 1 3/4 of an inch up from the bottom of the clipped side and 3/8 of an inch from the other side. This is where the foam will go. I'll go ahead and take 2 of the pieces, match them right sides together and clip them in place. Then I'll start on the squared off side and sew down to the first turn, pivot, and keep doing this all the way around until I'm back to the top on the other side. Again, this is the only other piece I'll be sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Only the flaps and these shoulder straps have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Everything else moving forward is going to be 3/8 of an inch. Once I've sewn all the way around, I'll trim about 1/8 of an inch off the seam allowance by the turns to help those sit nicely once I've flipped it right side out. Now I can get the foam on. The foam is meant to sit just inside the stitching on both sides, and it will line up with my lower and upper marks, so I'll get it fused in place on both sides of both straps. Then I can flip the strap right side out. There's different kind of tube turners and such that you can use for this. I just do it by hand. It is a bit tedious, but just take your time and get them flipped. Once it's turned, you'll want to roll out these corners the best you can, but they don't need to be 100% perfect since they'll be covered anyways. Then I'm going to make sure the seams are even on both sides, and I'll mark the middle of the strap all the way down. I'll use this as a stitch line, so I'll follow that line and stitch all the way down the strap to lock that foam in place. Now I can get the bigger strap connectors on, even with the foam on the side with the raw edge. You may want to fold the outer edges of the straps in just to make sure they don't stick out of the strap connector. So I'll mark 3/8 of an inch up, which is even with the foam. Then I'll get one strap connector in place, making sure the middles match, and I'll flip it over and get another in place on the other side, making sure they match up perfectly. I like to start at the bottom so that the back stitching will be covered. Then I'll sew all the way around the strap connector 1/8 of an inch from the edge until I get back to where I started. Once I've done that for both straps, I can move on to my triangle ring connector as well as the other strap connectors. For the tri-ring connector, I'll sew from end to end on both sides, and for the strap connectors, I'm going to mark 1/8 of an inch from both ends, and I'll sew from line to line. So I'll sew the tri-ring connector from end to end on both sides. Then I'll do the strap connector and I'll sew from one mark to the other. I'm just going to finish the triangle ring quick. So I'll start by folding the connector over it so that the ends meet. Then I'll go ahead and baste it 1/4 of an inch from the end, making sure all the edges match up, and then I can set that aside for now. Then on the strap connectors, I'll find the middle and mark 1/2 inch in each direction from there. Again, the hardware will sit in the middle, so I'm only going to glue the outer 2 areas. I'm going to get the 2 strap connectors on now, so I'll find the middle and mark 1/2 inch in each direction from there, as well as 1.5 inches up from the bottom, and I'll do this on both sides of both ends of both straps. Then I'll start on the side with the other strap connectors I just sewed on, and I'll stick one side in place within the markings. Then I'll slide the rectangle ring in and stick the other side in place. The strap connector should be perfectly even on both sides. Then I'll sew across this finished edge to lock both sides in place. So I'll sew across that line from where the stitching ends on one side to where it ends on the other side, turn around and stitch back across, finishing with the back stitch. The goal of this is to get the stitching perfectly even on the top and bottom. I'm going to add 2 rivets in the middle here to lock the full strap in place. You could also do an X stitch or just sew across the bottom. It's completely up to you. I'll do the other 2 strap connectors shortly, but I have a couple other things I'm going to do first. starting with the straps, I'm going to mark 1/8 of an inch from the finished edge, and I'll sew from that mark all the way down to the unfinished edge. Then I'll turn it around and sew from the unfinished edge to the mark on the other side. Once you've done that for both straps, you can add the sliders. So I'll start by marking 2 3/4 of an inch from the finished edge on the wrong side. Then from the back, I'll come through the top of the slider and back down through the bottom. I'll get some glue on the edge and I'll stick it in place, matching that edge with the line I just marked out. Now I can sew across that edge there to lock it in. So similar to what I did for the strap connector, I'll start where the stitching ends on one side, sew across to the other side, turn around and sew back. And I'm also going to add a rivet just below the edge there. I'm going to get the straps on now. Watch this part closely. So with the wrong side of the adjustable strap facing up and the right side of the shoulder strap facing up, I'll come through the back of the rectangle ring, come down and through the top of the slider and back down through the bottom. This way everything ends up facing right side up, and this is also what makes your strap adjustable. Now I just need to get the triangles on. I'm going to glue those in place with the triangles facing in opposite directions on each side, since I have my left and right side. So I'll glue it on, matching the edge of the strap with the fold just before the middle of the triangle, and I'll fold it in half to finish it. I need to sew it up now, so I'll stitch across this edge to the end, go a couple stitches down, then stitch back across 3/8 of an inch from the edge. So I'll sew it on, making sure to go slow and making sure to keep everything lined up. The strap should look something like this now, and now all that's left to do is get the other strap connectors on to attach both sides to the triangle ring. So I already have everything marked out, and I'll do the same thing I did before, sticking one side of the connector in place, looping it through the triangle ring and sticking it back in place on the other side. Then just like before, I'll sew across the edge to lock the strap connectors in place, trying to make sure that stitching is perfectly even on both sides. And now my straps are both facing right side up and they're all ready to go. And the last thing I'm going to do is just add some rivets in the upper strap connectors, just like I did for the lower ones. I can get everything onto the back bar now, so I'll start by marking 1/2 inch down from the top edge, and I'll mark the middle as well. From the middle, I'm going to mark 1 1/4 inch and 2 1/4 inch in both directions. And I'm also going to mark 1/2 inch from the middle in both directions. The handle will line up within those outer areas and the triangle ring in the middle area. I'll start by sticking the triangle ring in place in that center area with the bottom edge in line with that 1/2 inch mark. The wrong side should also be facing down. This way when the shoulder straps flop over, they're facing right side up. Then I'll get the handles in place in those outer areas, again, wrong side to wrong side. Finally, I'll get the flap in place, matching the middles with the right side facing down, and again, the bottom edge of the flap should be in line with that 1/2 inch line I marked out at the start. Now I'm almost ready to get the back bar in place, but first I need to mark where it'll go, so I'll mark 2 3/8 of an inch down from the top of the back, as well as 4 3/8 of an inch down. Then I'll tape the back bar in place within that area, making sure it's all centered. You can go ahead and sew it on now. I always do the bottom edge first, even though it doesn't really matter. Either way, you'll sew 1/8 of an inch from the edge all the way across. Then I'll sew the top edge, again 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Go slow on this side just to make sure you're staying in line over the bumps. It can also be helpful to gently hammer the area with the handles down before sewing, just to help reduce the bulk a little bit. If you want to add some extra durability to the handles and flap, you could also add a second row of stitching, add rivets, or what I like to do is just double stitch the top row. Once the back bar is done, all I need to do is get the triangles in place. You'll see these markings on the pattern pieces. You can go ahead and transfer those to the fabric. You'll want to line the bottom point of the triangles up with those marks on each side. And I'll get those basted in place, sewing about 1/4 of an inch from the edge to lock them in. The back is done now, the straps are all done, and I got the triangles and back bar sewn in place. So now I'm about ready to start putting all the base pieces together. First, I just need to get the piping on the bottom. So I'll start with one end of the piping just past the middle on the back side, and I'll start clipping it in place all the way around, matching the edges and using the slits to spread it around the curves. Once I'm back to where I started, I'll open up the piping and trim the cord so it matches with the other end of the cord. Then I'll trim a bit of the excess fabric off and I'll fold that edge back to create a finished edge. Then I'll slide the other end of the cord in there and clip it in place. I also like to try to match the folded edge up with the middle mark. Now I just have to base the piping in place, sewing all the way around about 1/4 of an inch from the edge, making sure everything stays in line as I sew. I'm ready to start combining the pieces now. I like to do the front and side pieces first. You could just put the pieces right sides together and sew it with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, but I like to just fold both sides of the front panel in and top stitch it to the side panels. I think it's cleaner this way and it's a bit easier around the pockets. I also have confidence in doing this though because I'm using contact cement and a heavyweight thread. So if you're on a domestic machine using a lighter thread, I'd recommend sewing the seam before top stitching it. So I'm going to start by marking 3/4 of an inch from both sides of the front panel. Then I'll spread some glue within those areas and fold both edges into their respective lines. Then I can glue the front panel to one of the side panels, matching the edge of the side panel to the folded edge of the front panel. And now I can top stitch it, sewing 1/8 of an inch from the edge all the way down. Even if you sewed this into a seam, I'd still recommend doing this top stitching here. It obviously adds durability, but it also just helps shape the bag too. Once you've done both sides, it should look something like this. And before you get the back on, you'll want to mark 3/4 of an inch down from the top on all 4 body pieces. I'll use this as a fold line shortly. I can get the back on now. For the back, I like to just sew the seam instead of folding it. So I'll match it right sides together with one of the side panels and I'll clip it in place. Then I'll sew the pieces together with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And I also like to back stitch on the area where the triangle is just to really lock it in. Then I'll go ahead and top stitch that seam, stitching on the back panel 1/8 of an inch from the edge, going slow to make sure everything stays even. I'll get the last 2 sides clipped and sewn together now. This last side is a bit more difficult to top stitch. You really got to finesse it through the machine, and depending on how stiff your fabric is and what kind of machine you're using, you may even have to do half of the seam, turn it around, and then do the other half of it. But if you're not comfortable top stitching this last seam, you can always just skip the top stitching on both of the back seams. I just probably wouldn't do just one and not the other. Now that the body is all sewn together, I'm ready to get the bottom on, but first I just need to cut 1/4 inch slits all around the base to help it spread around the curves. Then I can get the bottom on, matching the middle marks on the front and the back, and then using the slits to spread it the rest of the way around the curves. You can sew the bottom on now. Like I mentioned earlier, if you're doing the piping, you'll need to use a presser foot that can get right up next to the cord. You won't be able to see the piping as you sew, but you will be able to feel it. So just make sure you're staying pressed up against it to keep your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and just go slow to make sure everything stays even as you sew. Then once the bottom is sewn on, all I need to do is fold the top edge down to the line we marked out using tape or glue. This will give us our finished edge on top. Now I'm going to make the lining real quick. I did this zipper pocket and slip pocket on the lining. These aren't actual pattern pieces, but the measurements as well as the positioning for them are both listed in the notes on the front page of the pattern if you want to do them. Regardless, I'm going to get this all sewn up now. First, I just need to mark 3/4 of an inch down from the top on both pieces. You'll also notice that these pieces aren't perfect rectangles and that they're a bit smaller than the base pieces of the bag. This is because the inner dimensions of the bag are slightly smaller than the outer dimensions, and we want the lining to sit nice and tight inside the bag. The lining pieces come in at an angle slightly, with the wider end being the top. So as we match these pieces right sides together and clip them in place, make sure you're matching the wider end to the wider end. Then go ahead and sew down the first side with your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once that's sewn, you'll want to press those seams open, and we'll top stitch both sides 1/4 of an inch from that seam to keep it pressed open. I'll do the same thing on the other seam, again sewing it, then pressing it open and top stitching both sides. Once it's all sewn up, I'll cut 1/4 inch slits around the entire bottom. Then I'll get the bottom piece clipped in place, matching it right sides together. Just like before, I'll match the middles on the front and the middles on the back, and I'll use the slits to spread it the rest of the way around the curves. And finally, I'll sew the bottom on with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, making sure everything stays lined up, especially as I go around the curves. Lastly, you just need to get the top edge folded down to that 3/4 of an inch line we marked out earlier. Then the lining is done, and it should look something like this. This part isn't required, but I like the lining to be nice and tight and not be able to pull up or shift. So I'm going to match the bottom of the lining to the bottom of the base, wrong wrong side to wrong side, and I'll sew around the edge about 1/4 of an inch, just basting them together to lock them in place. Now this is typically where I would pull the lining up and match the top edge of the lining and base, and with the bag still inside out, I'd top stitch them together. It's easier to sew on the top side with the bag inside out, but since I have a cylinder arm machine, I'm gonna flip the bag first and then stitch it. So I'll get the bag flipped right side out, and now regardless of whether you're flipping it before or after sewing, you'll want to spend some time shaping the bag. It's likely going to be a bit deformed after turning it, so just take your time working the seams out, making sure that they're facing the right way and that everything's fully pushed out and sitting nicely. You honestly should spend at least 5 to 10 minutes just shaping the bag once it's turned. I'm going to sew the lining in now, so I'll match the middle of the lining to the middle of the back and do the same on the front. Then I'll match the seams of the lining to the middle of each side panel, and then I'll get everything else lined up in between as well, making sure that the tops of the lining and base are even all the way around. I'll go ahead and sew it now, stitching 1/8 of an inch from the edge all the way around to combine the base and the lining. I started on my cylinder arm machine, but the machine was giving me some issues, so I switched back to my flatbed machine and ended up sewing it on there. I didn't want to flip the bag again, which I guess goes to show that you can sew the lining in after flipping the bag as well. It's still fairly easy this way, but I do find it easier to do before turning the bag. Regardless, once the bag is both sewn and turned, I can add my grommets to it, which is what the pull cord will run through. There's markings on the front and side pattern pieces. The only ones that aren't marked out are the 2 grommets that go on the back, but you can find those measurements in the notes on the front page, and I'll show it more in a sec here. So I'll get all the grommets marked out. Just remember the distance from the top and side has seam allowance, which you've already sewn. So subtract 3/8 of an inch from the top and side when you measure those markings to transfer them. Then you can go ahead and punch the holes for them. If you're using 1/4 inch grommets, you'll want to punch 1/4 inch holes. I'm using 3/8 inch grommets, so I'm going to punch 3/8 of an inch holes. Then I'll get the grommets in place as well. You can do this by hand or with a press. Once the grommets are in, they should look something like this. For the 2 on the back, they're both 1 5/8 of an inch from the finished seams on both sides. And I'm only doing 2 on the back because I don't want the back to actually cinch like the rest of the bag. I just want the cord to pass through that area and around to the other side. Now I'm going to get the pull cord ready. So I'm cutting a piece of 1/4 inch paracord that's 38 inches long. Obviously you can use whatever size cord you want based off whatever size grommets you decide to use. I do recommend the cord being about 1/8 of an inch thinner than the holes of the grommets. I'll get the cord in now, so I'll start from the front center and just weave it back and forth through the holes until I come out of the grommet next to the one I started in, and you should be left with the 2 ends of the cord just dangling in front. I need to make my cord slider now, which is what will help cinch the cord. So on both ends, I'm going to mark a 1/2 inch in, spread some glue, and fold those edges into their respective lines. Then I'll mark the middle and fold one side into the middle, turn it, and fold the other side in as well. Then I'll sew it up, so starting at 1/8 of an inch before the edge, I'll sew from there to 1/8 of an inch before the edge on the other side. I'll turn it around and do the other long side as well. Once it's sewn on the wrong side, I'll find the middle and mark an 1/8 of an inch from there. I'm going to be folding the opposite edge to that line, and then I'll fold the other edge in so that they overlap by a 1/4 inch. So I'll get a tiny bit of glue on there, fold that first edge into that 1/8 inch mark, then fold the other edge in, overlapping the 2 by a 1/4 of an inch. Then I'm going to stitch down the middle, which will both seal those 2 edges on the back as well as create the 2 areas for the cord ends to go through. So I'll get that sewn down in the middle, stitching down, then back up to finish the slider. Once it's done, I can get the cord ends through the loops. This piece is sized for a 1/4 inch cord, so if you're using a smaller cord, you may want to make the piece a tiny bit smaller, and if you're using a bigger cord, you'll definitely want to make it bigger. All that's left to do now is make the pull tab to hold the cord ends together. So I'll start by marking a 1/2 inch in on each end, folding the edges into those lines, marking the middle, and folding both sides in, just like I've been doing plenty of times by now. Then when I fold it in half over the cord, I should be left with this 1 1/8 of an inch by 1 1/8 of an inch square. Again, if you're using a different size cord, you may want to change the size of this piece. Regardless, I'll match the cord ends and mark 1 1/8 of an inch up. And I also like to base the 2 cord ends together. It just makes this next part easier. So I'll match one end of the pull tab up with the line I marked out, making making sure it's centered. Then I'll fold it over and stick the other half in place on the back side, making sure both sides line up perfectly. Then I just need to sew a square 1/8 of an inch from the edge all the way around. I'll get that sewn. Take your time with this. It's literally the last step, so finish it out strong. If you want, you can always add an X stitch in the middle or a rivet, but I like to just double stitch at least the top edge. Once you finish the pull tab, the bag is done. I am super happy with how this piece came out. The details on it are so clean, and I'm looking forward to getting a lot of use out of it. It really is such a high quality bag, and it was a great way to use some upcycled materials. Before you go, I have a couple more things I'm going to teach you that could help with making this bag, and I'm also going to show you the bag on body so that you have a size reference. Like I mentioned before, this pattern is probably in the intermediate range, but there is some ways to simplify some things, so I'm going to run you through a few of those. I use the heavyweight backing to help structure some things, but in turn it does make things a bit stiffer, which can make things a bit trickier to sew. So if you're not comfortable with the heavyweight backing, you could always skip it or just use an interfacing or something instead. Especially for this bag design, it's not supposed to be a super structured bag, so you'd be completely fine without the heavyweight backing. Similarly, I also do the piping because it helps add some structure, but like I mentioned before, you do need a presser foot that can get right up next to that cord to sew it. So if you don't have one and can't get one, you'll need to skip that. If it's just making the piping that intimidates you, you could always get store-bought piping as well, but I promise doing the piping is really not that difficult. Just have some patience with it, and I promise you can do it. Lastly, this isn't necessarily about making things easier, but like I mentioned before, you don't necessarily have to do the quick release buckles for the closure method. Every time I've made this bag, in fact, I've done a different type of closure method. I've done everything from snap buttons to even overall hooks, and you know, the little clasp on the chest, I've used those as well. So there's a lot of different ways that you could do it. I just decided to show it with quick releases because I think it's a fairly beginner friendly version of doing it, and they are very efficient for the bag. You know, just be able to open it real quick that way. But like I said, you could do snap buttons or something if you want this strap to come up, and you do some snap buttons up here, or there's really endless closure methods you could do. So experiment with that. That's one of my favorite parts about this design. Here's the bag on body. For reference, I'm 6'4", but the straps are adjustable, so don't worry about that too much unless if you're making the bag for a kid or something. This bag really came out so beautifully. I love the design I did for it with the distressing and hand stitching, but it's also just such a functional pattern too. Like, this is really such a great school bag or personal bag for traveling and so on. There's so many different good uses for this pattern, and I just love the functionality of it so much, the convenience of it, the size. I think it's just a very well-rounded pattern. I hope this tutorial was easy to follow. I'm still learning as I go, and I want to make the tutorials as helpful as possible. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments and I'll do my best to help. If you want to see some more of my work, I'm also on Instagram and TikTok. And if you want more tutorials, make sure to subscribe here. I'm going to be posting at least one tutorial a month, hopefully a lot more than that. And I'm also going to be doing giveaways for people who purchase my patterns and even people who just comment and subscribe on here. Have fun making your backpack. This pattern can really be customized in so many different ways, so get creative with it. I can't wait to see what you guys make. I love y'all.